This is a new model of the Western canon, which is to say, an account of the origins of the great foundational works of the Western tradition. It proposes a different account of these origins to that of the received and accepted accounts. It is offered as a broad paradigm for understanding the nature of this canonical literature, the nature of this tradition in general terms, and the broad trajectory of the historical era that gave birth to these works. Our predicament is that we have received a canon of foundational works from the ancient world, but we have little clear idea of how this literature was actually formed. The hallowed narratives attached to these works are unsustainable in litero-historical terms. All of our texts have mysterious origins. The struggle is to provide a model for the deeper context from which they have emerged. The main proposal of this model is that these literary works, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the Old and New Testaments, the Hermetica, all of them are the products of what we will call elite scribal cultures. These are junctures in history where there is a particular concentration of literacy, where a type of monopoly on literacy is achieved. Literate high cultures, assemblies of highly literate people, a class of people of exceptional literary sophistication, peak literate cultures. In this model, these come about with the absorption or appropriation of rival centres of literate cultural production. Although this is only to say that intellectual production tends to concentrate in the centre of empires. This is the history of empires. The Western canon is the product of ancient empires. The model identifies three centres of such elite scribal cultures spread over many centuries: in Athens, in Alexandria, and in Rome. It proposes that these are the places where the great works of the Western canon were produced, regardless of claims and narratives to the contrary. In each case, the critical factor was the absorption of rival centres and the consolidation of a type of monopoly on literature and literary production. In Athens, the expansion of the Athenian Empire brought the Homeridae of Chios and the culture of the Ionian world into Athenian intellectual life. Athens achieved a type of cultural monopoly, the centre of Pan-Hellenism. This produced the epics of Homer, which in this model are literate works dressed up as oral poems, but made and written in Athens. There is an elite scribal culture in Athens, and it produces the epics of Homer. Importantly, it also produces Plato, a reaction to Homer. Our model is Plato-centric. The influence of Plato and the works of Plato are pervasive. The conquest of Alexander carries this influence to the east. Our model charts the collision of east and west, with the influence of Plato, a product of the elite scribal culture of Athens, pervasive in the Hellenic world thereafter. There is a sense in which all subsequent works in the canon are derivative of Plato. There is a sense in which the canon is a working out of Platonic themes. In Alexandria, it was the absorption of the Judeans, the Hebrews, into Ptolemaic intellectual life that brought about an elite scribal culture. About a quarter of Alexandria was Jewish, they say, rich from trade, highly educated, Greek-speaking, highly literate. They were deliberately absorbed by policy into the edifice of Ptolemaic Alexandria. Fatefully, this produced the Old Testament, the Torah, specifically the Septuagint, dressed up as a translation, but made and written in Alexandria. There is an elite scribal culture in Alexandria, an extraordinary one, notable because of its library, an ambitious attempt to monopolise the literate culture of a civilization. And it produces the body of works we know as the Hebrew Scriptures. To elaborate on this, in this account the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah and the Septuagint, were two parts of the same project undertaken by scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, substantially under the influence of the Oriental Plato, that is, in the intellectual milieu of Ptolemaic Hellenism. Prior to that time, the Jews were as polytheistic as their neighbours. Monotheism arose as a momentous development, first from the Platonic one, but also as part of the fictitious claim that the Jews were an ancient people of Egypt. The Akhenaten revolution in Pharaonic history proposed that monotheism was original and that polytheism was a falling away from it. This was widely assumed thereafter, extending eventually into the Islamic worldview. Monotheism, therefore, implies great antiquity. The crafting of the Hebrew foundation narrative and laws, largely based on Plato's program for the founding of colonies as set out in his dialogue, The Laws, elevated the Semitic deity to a monotheism with an ancient history. We can answer two questions that have long occupied the curious. Did Moses influence Akhenaten? And even more pregnant, what was Plato but Moses speaking Greek? In both cases, the questions are framed the wrong way around. The Hebrew Scriptures are the product of the elite scribal culture of Ptolemaic Alexandria. In Rome, there are 3 phases where this monopoly on literacy comes about. First, when the Romans acquired and absorbed by force the Greek heritage. The Romans invaded Greece. Their practice was to enslave the literate class of those they vanquished. The spoils of Sulla included taking an entire literate class of Greece back to Rome as slaves and deliberately setting them to work on projects of literate production. In this model, the works of Aristotle are produced from this fusion. Their purpose is to link Plato with Alexander the Great. In fact, the whole history of the Academy is a Roman production. This elite scribal culture rewrites, reconstructs the Greek tradition and produces Aristotle as part of that project. In this model, Aristotle is a Roman production grafted onto Plato as part of the fertile myth-building that surrounded Alexander, the god-man, the philosopher-king, when the Romans absorbed Alexander's civilizing mission to the east. A similar thing happens under the Flavians. When they defeat the Judeans and sack the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, they take the entire Jewish literate class back to Rome as slaves, deliberately setting them to work on projects of literate production. This creates an elite scribal culture. The works of Flavius Josephus are an extant product of this phase of Roman literary consolidation. And an extension of this, a second phase, it happens again after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Second Jewish War. There was a movement of slaves and literate people generally to Rome. Rome won. The revolt was overthrown. The Jews were comprehensively defeated. The rebellion and its ideology, seen as continuous since the Maccabees and conflated into a single struggle, was finally crushed. The East was devastated by war. The literate class of the East relocated to the centre of the empire. Thus, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Rome becomes an elite scribal culture by our definition, a place with a deep concentration of highly literate people, of great literary sophistication, with all rival cultures defeated and absorbed. It produces a body of work we know as the New Testament, the Gospels and the Epistles, which are seen in this model as mid-2nd century productions, drawing on the Flavian phase, conflating the successive Jewish uprisings, but a post-Bar Kokhba Jewish-Gentile synthesis. Again, in every case, the critical factor is the absorption of a rival literate people. Athens absorbs the Homiridai. Alexandria absorbs the Hellenic Jews. Rome absorbs the Greeks. And then Rome absorbs the vanquished Jews after the 2 Jewish wars. The works of the Western canon are hybrids that come about when elite scribal cultures become unrivaled. All the same, elite scribal cultures are momentary in history. They are fertile conditions that rarely last long. And once they dissolve, their sophistications are poorly understood by subsequent generations. Further to this, we must emphasise certain important features of ancient literacy. For a start, of course, few people were literate compared to the modern ideal of universal literacy. Literacy was an elite activity. The control of books, copying, publishing and literacy in general was possible in a way modern people can hardly appreciate. We are always talking about a small group of people, an elite, and their activities are necessarily intermingled with factors of politics and political agendas. That is, it was normal in the ancient world for literate production to be sponsored by the state. The cult of Serapis is added to our scheme. The state was actively involved in the creation and promulgation of syncretic religion and other cultural systems to bridge East and West. Plato's noble lie is an assumed part of ancient statecraft and relevant to this literature. Yet, typically, the works of the Western canon are dressed up as having lowly origins. Homer was a blind, wandering poet. In reality, the epics were written by the scribal elite of Athens. The Torah is the law of ancient exiles who wandered in the desert for 40 years. In reality, the Hebrew scriptures are the work of the Hellenic Jewish elite of Alexandria. The works of Aristotle were recovered from the basement of Athens, where they had been stashed and lost for centuries. In reality, they were produced by the Greek-speaking scribal elite of Rome as they reworked the Greek heritage. The Gospels are eyewitness accounts by poor fishermen. In reality, they are produced by the elite scribal culture of Rome consolidated after 2 Jewish wars. This is a feature of the Western canon, sophisticated elite literature posing as a folk literature with humble origins. We should emphasise the word scribal here, elite scribal cultures. Typically these works are attributed to some illustrious or heroic figure, that is, like the Book of Moses. But in reality they are collaborative works, the works not of individuals but of schools. They are produced by a scribal culture. The modern romantic notion of the lone writer is fallacious. Literary projects were undertaken by teams of people. Elite writers had teams of scribes, either freemen or slaves. Boethius perhaps wrote alone, perforce he was in jail, but the norm in ancient times was for several people to be engaged in the act of writing, and for important people many. Flavius Josephus boasts that he had a staff of over 100 helping him write his histories, official histories, state-endorsed and sponsored. Works of sophistication were produced by teams of scribes, just as, they say, a team of 70 worked on the Septuagint, a story that is revealing. So while we are always talking about a small group of people, an elite, the mode of production was typically collaborative. Even the works of Plato are very likely the product of a school. Certainly the idea of Plato sitting alone in an olive grove in deep thought composing his dialogues is far from the facts. So too the epistles of Paul, the product of the school of Marcion. A wealthy man, Marcion ran a school in Rome where he fled from the chaos in the east after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Such schools are the typical setting for elite literary production under our model. Works are not so much written as massaged into their final form by multiple hands and minds, highly trained hands and minds. We should never underestimate their textual prowess. We are always dealing with very adept writers. The diffusion of Plato in Hellenism is relevant here because Plato is, throughout, the model for scribal education in the worlds and empires created by the conquests of Alexander. The Jews of Alexandria, the students of Marcion, the literate slaves of Rome, every literate person is educated on Plato, steeped in the texts of Plato, learning high literate Greek and the art of rhetoric by copying out the texts of Plato. So again, the influence of Plato is pervasive because it is pervasive in ancient literate culture, East and West, generally. Aristotle is plainly para-Platonic or counter-Platonic, a parallel literature just as Virgil is a parallel literature to Homer. But Plato is behind the Septuagint and the Gospels and the Hermetica. The Platonic text and Platonic philosophy is pervasive and underpins the entire canon in this reading. A final feature of this literature is that it is typically pseudonymous. This is something modern people with notions of individuality and originality and copyright and modern notions of fiction barely understand. The creation of pious fictions was not only common but the norm. It was the norm in scribal training. If one wanted to present an argument, rather than compose an essay, one composes a letter or dialogue in the name of some authoritative or heroic figure. It is a mode of training and a mode of making philosophy, and even more so, theology. Pseudonymity is a mode. And historical fictions can come about in the same way. This is Platonic too. Plato's story of the counter-Homeric epic, the Atlanticus, serves as a model for historical fictions, and more widely for the literary mode of verisimilitude. So too, Plato's model of removing himself from his works and writing through the voice of others, notably Socrates in his case. The works of the Western canon are pseudonymous. It is a literature of hidden authors. Moses didn't write the books of Moses. Paul didn't write the letters of Paul. Aristotle didn't write the Aristotelian corpus. Luke didn't write the Gospel of Luke. But ancient scribes would strive for verisimilitude in a standard set by Plato, who is, in this sense, the fountainhead of pious fictions. What is true and what seems true is in continuous tension here, and is arguably the philosophical theme of the entire canon, the profoundly Platonic theme of the relation of the written word to truth and persuasion, being and seeming. There is a sense of high play or a noble game around this theme, throughout and behind our texts, which is especially lost on the modern mind, but is especially important to grasp because it is like the water in which the fish swim. This high play in elite scribal cultures is the matrix of our canon. This, I contend, is the nature of the literature under consideration, and such is the general shape of its history. The language of this canon is Greek. Plato is the preeminent exponent. The conquest of Alexander spread this influence to the east. The literature we regard as canonical is the product of this diffusion and hybridization, with the critical moments being the formation of elite scribal cultures, effective monopolies on high literacy, often occasioned by wars, politics, invasions, the tectonic clash of civilizations. Assuredly, every movement and turn in this history is complex, but in the first instance, we need to establish a general model as an alternative to the unsatisfactory and unsustainable ones that prevail today. This is the working model that I offer. It seeks to give a general but also all-encompassing or sweeping overview of the genesis of the Western canon from a strictly litero-historical perspective that conforms to the nature of the case.